often involved in heavy metal music serves as a catalyst for their involvement. Suffice it to say that I find their motivations for the formation of this organization questionable. Regardless, they claim their concerns were real, as among other things they blamed rising rates of suicide and rape among teenagers on the music they listened to. Predictably though, the way they came to their conclusions about the dangers of music, especially heavy metal, was extremely questionable. Their case basically comes down to young white males were the primary audience for heavy metal, and were also the most likely to commit suicide, so obviously the two have to be connected. Basically, they were just working backwards, creating the connections that they wanted to see. They had reached a conclusion, without any research, that music was responsible for all of society's ills, and then went looking for the evidence to support their claims, which of course they eventually found. This, however, is not how things are supposed to work. By working this way, you ignore everything that doesn't support what you've already determined to be true. An honest investigation would have started searching for reasons for the issues without a predetermined cause in mind, and just followed where the evidence led them, not followed their conclusion to evidence that supported it, no matter how flimsy it was. The thing is, what the PMRC and their allies were doing wasn't what you would call unique, as demonizing music, blaming it for all of society's ills, and trying to censor it wasn't new in America. For example, blues and jazz, which also happen to be primarily African-American genres, had been some of the main targets in decades past. So it's suspicious that heavy metal and rap are the two genres primarily targeted in the 80s, as these two genres were associated with either working class youth in metal's case or with African Americans in the case of rap music. Yet despite their flimsy evidence, the women leading the charge were incredibly effective after working alongside their politician husbands for years. With these politically adept women leading the way, the PMRC naturally grew in power in conservative Reagan-era Washington. Plus, it didn't hurt that the PMRC was promoting a convenient solution, a simple explanation for all of society's perceived ills. For the politically minded moral crusaders then, metal and the other musical acts that found themselves in the PMRC's crosshairs were just easy targets. They were telling people who were upset about the state of the world that it was all this one thing's fault. It was simple and neat. There was no need then to look at the rising poverty rates or anything like that. And their solution to the problem wasn't really going to cost anything either. Plus, and maybe more importantly, the people who would most take issue with their narrative were in general not politically active, and were oftentimes too young to vote. So it was really easy to demonize such people and call them moral degenerates, as there would be no political consequences as a result. As for how the PMRC went about their campaign against the vile influence of, let me check my notes again, music, they set about garnering the attention of the media by reading out-of-context lyrics to the cameras, blowing up album art, and putting together a list termed the Filthy 15 of the, in their opinion, worst offenders. The Filthy 15, if you're curious, consisted of Prince, Sheena Easton, Judas Priest, Vanity, Motley Crue, AC/DC, Twisted Sister, Madonna, Wasp, Def Leppard, Merciful Fate, Black Sabbath, The Mary Jane Girls, Venom, and Cyndi Lauper. The goal of the PMRC and their conservative backers was the creation of some kind of warning labels that would be placed on music packaging. Indeed, they even created their own quote-unquote porn rock rating system, with an X for profane or sexually explicit lyrics, O for occult references, D/A for lyrics about drugs and alcohol, and V for violent content. Now, predictably, there was pushback from artists and the music industry as a whole, so Congress held hearings that were attended by several major figures from the industry who would testify while religious protesters outside held up signs that said things like, "Rock music destroys kids." Among those who spoke during these hearings were Frank Zappa, Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, and John Denver. Zappa made his opinion clear on the PMRC and their so-called porn rock rating system as he testified, quote, "The PMRC proposal is an ill-conceived piece of nonsense which fails to deliver any real benefits to children, infringes the civil liberties of people who are not children, and promises to keep the courts busy for years, dealing with the interpretational and enforcemental problems inherent in the proposal's design. It is my understanding that in law, First Amendment issues are decided with a preference for the least restrictive alternative. In this context, the PMRC demands are the equivalent of treating dandruff by decapitation." For Zappa, there was no question what the PMRC was proposing was simply a form of censorship under the thin guise of a rating system and warning labels. As he declared before Congress, quote, "If it looks like censorship and it smells like censorship, it is censorship, no matter whose wife is talking about it." Zappa's greatest fear, though, seemingly was that it wouldn't just end with the currently proposed rating system. Instead, he would state that, quote, "The establishment of a rating system opens the door to an endless parade of moral quality control programs. What if the next bunch of Washington wives demands a large yellow J on all material written or performed by Jews in order to save helpless children from exposure to concealed Zionist doctrine?" D. Snyder would also speak before Congress, likewise arguing that the PMRC's plan was a straightforward infringement on civil liberties. In doing so, Snyder suspects he took more than a few people in the hall by surprise, as he suspected that, quote, "They contacted my management and wanted to know if I could come and testify, figuring let's get the most recognizable character in metal at the time and put him up there as the poster boy for censorship. They were caught off guard because they didn't know I spoke English fluently. They had thought he was little more than that essentially cartoon character he portrayed in their music videos who wore makeup and dressed in drag. After all, it's not like Twisted Sister got famous for their clever introspective lyrics. Yet, instead of a simple-minded degenerate who would prove their case for them, Snyder, more often than not, turned the tables against the PMRC and their allies. For example, when being questioned by Al Gore, Snyder would suggest that it should be up to the parents and not the government to decide what is or is not appropriate music for their children to consume. Gore then asked the rock star if it was reasonable to ask parents to do such a task, to which Snyder responded, quote, "Being a parent isn't a reasonable thing, it's a hard thing. I'm a parent and I know." A statement that likely took the people trying to demonize him by surprise. After those two spoke, it was John Denver's turn to testify. Now, there had been no surprise where the metal singer and the experimental rocker stood on this issue, but John Denver was kind of an all-American figure. The man even had his own Christmas special on TV. Surely he would stand with the holy moralizing forces of the PMRC. Spoiler, he did not, as John Denver refused to be on the side of censorship. In fact, he even compared their efforts to the Nazi book burnings. Now, these major artists were not the only people speaking out against the PMRC and their plans. Also speaking out against the PMRC just on a much smaller scale was the lead singer of a Seattle-area glam metal band named Sleaze. Sleaze primarily played Slayer and Armored Saint covers, and even prior to the PMRC uproar, they already had to deal with limited opportunities to play live thanks to Seattle's Teen Dance Ordinance, a law designed to make it difficult to impossible for venues to play host to teen gatherings, a law that would eventually be used to target the city's burgeoning rap and hip-hop communities. So, you see the lead singer of Sleaze, a young man named Lane Staley, seemingly recognized that the moralizing forces behind this ordinance were the same types of people behind the PMRC. So, when local station KOMO's news program Town Meeting in 1985 had one of the PMRC's co-founders Sally Nevins on, Lane made sure he was in the audience. He would then take the opportunity when offered to speak out against the PMRC's censorship, especially when it was coming from people who knew nothing about the music they were targeting. Yet, despite protests from artists big and small, all of their attempts to stop the PMRC and its plans would prove fruitless, thanks in large part to the Recording Industry Association of America, or RIAA, the recording industry's leading trade group, voluntarily agreeing to a rating system which placed a warning sticker on potentially offensive albums. Doing so because the RIAA were at the same time lobbying for the right to collect a fee for blank recording media and hardware. Unsurprisingly then, following this capitulation, when the bill came up giving the RIAA a cut of the sales of blank tapes that were cutting into their business, it passed. Meanwhile, the PMRC's black and white parental advisory label began appearing on album covers at the discretion of individual labels. Now, to some extent, this backfired, as for a certain subset of artists, these hearings and these labels were a positive. You see, some of the more obscure metal bands who were brought up as an example of everything wrong with America would see a sales boost as a result of this publicity. The PMRC then, by shining a spotlight on what they thought was unacceptable, only brought more attention to it, as there was obviously a segment of the population that upon seeing the parental advisory sticker viewed it as a badge of honor. By which I mean these people believed that if a record got that sticker it had to be worth checking out. That being said, this wasn't the case for all artists. You see, after labeling came into effect, despite claims that this was all to allow consumers to make an informed choice, multiple retailers including Camelot Music and Video, Sears, JCPenney, and Walmart, among others, all declared that they would no longer carry records bearing the parental warning sticker. Meanwhile, other stores declared they would not sell the records to minors, meaning they required ID when purchasing labeled records. In response to this situation, the record companies urged their artists to sanitize their lyrics, which in effect is censorship despite the PMRC's claims that would not happen. This backlash would also damage careers. For example, Joanne McDuffie of the Mary Jane Girls would later say, quote, "It kind of blacklisted me from certain areas of the business. We didn't get the Grammys, we didn't get the American Music Awards because of the PMRC. It cut me off at a certain point. I think that kind of stopped us before we got started. It stopped everything so that now there are only certain audiences who know about our music, because it might not have played in certain areas or on certain radio stations. I think it hurt me." Try as they might claim otherwise, then the rating system, because it resulted in major chains not carrying certain records, did censor artists. As for the PMRC's legacy, fear-mongering was common in the Reagan era, and it seems like a whole new industry was created for self-proclaimed occult experts to go around giving lectures to PTAs and the like around the country. Apparently, wanting to get in on this action after the hearings, the PMRC would go on to run a pay-per-minute phone service that gave out advice about Satanism. Something so insane it's what inspired me to do an episode on the Satanic Panic, and if you're interested, go listen to the remastered expanded edition for more information. Meanwhile, in the midst of this moral panic in March 1987, 4 teens in Bergenfield, New Jersey participated in a suicide pact that claimed all their lives. A tragic event that was quickly turned into fodder for the rumor mill, since some of these individuals were supposedly heavy metal fans. Rumors then began to swirl, blaming Iron Maiden for their deaths, with that band in particular being targeted, potentially because they just happened to be playing at the nearby Meadowlands in a few weeks. A situation that led to a number of camera crews from local stations attending said concert. In response, lead singer and frontman of Iron Maiden Bruce Dickinson would address the crowd and the cameras at the start of the show, acknowledging the tragedy of the situation up front and how he'd been asked to address them, as apparently some of the kids had been heavy metal fans. He quickly, though, cut to the heart of this whole situation when he said that, quote, "One or two people in this world who I think have more of an eye for a fast buck and a quick headline than for common sense and the truth have somehow decided that the tragic death of these kids is going to somehow be laid at the door of music, and I think that's terrible." And he's not wrong. It's always the same. Instead of trying to deal with the actual, probably difficult issues involved in such a tragic occurrence, there are always people out there ready to make a scapegoat out of something. Be it heavy metal, rap, movies, or video games, there's always someone out there with an agenda looking for something to blame. To which Dickinson would tell the crowd, quote, "Whenever anybody says something about our kind of music, you just tell them that what we're doing up here is not evil, it's not bad, it's there to make people happy." The story, though, didn't end there, because the presence of these camera crews potentially helped to lead to the quote-unquote riot that took place in the parking lot of the venue later that night, with the so-called riot consisting of a lot of smashed bottles and a pair of cars being turned over and set on fire. Events that more than anything else seem to have just been the product of heavy alcohol consumption. While no one was seemingly hurt as a result of this riot, given the atmosphere at the time, this was treated like it was a big deal, and of course heavy metal was blamed. This despite the fact that the quote-unquote riot took place in the parking lot while the concert was still going on, meaning the vast majority of the people who had come for the show took no part in the destruction. 2020, though, would do an extended piece covering both the suicides and the incident in the parking lot as they looked to capitalize on the fear of heavy metal that was so prevalent at the time, during which they interviewed Bruce Dickinson, the lead singer of Iron Maiden, who would tell the so-called news magazine, quote, "I wish people would get a sense of proportion about what's right and wrong and who are the real people that are poisoning people's minds and why they are doing it." Again calling out the grifters behind the various moral panics taking place at the time. Dickinson would then directly address the accusation that heavy metal calls, quote, outrageous and even sick behavior, by asking his own question, quote, "You mean like selling arms to Iran? Or you mean like all the guys doing insider trading? Or you mean all these companies dumping toxic waste everywhere? You know, but because they wear suits and ties, it's okay. They're not sick." While thrash very much remained the underground form of heavy metal, it was still definitely starting to catch on. Joining the bands I've already discussed were groups like Anthrax, who we already touched on briefly during Metallica's stay in New York, prior to the recording of their first album. The group had formed in 1981 around high school classmates Scott Ian and Danny Looker, who were joined by a revolving door of members. They started off well though, as their first ever show was a battle of the bands in a church basement, a contest which they won by doing covers of Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. Anthrax were young and eager, as they reportedly constantly bugged Johnny Z to listen to their stuff. Johnny though always put them off, thinking they were just annoying. Then when he finally did